Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to Switch to Life. And in today's video, we are going to be reviewing the third movie in the Disney Cinderella franchise, which is the direct-to-DVD sequel, Cinderella 3: A Twist in Time, which, unlike the first sequel, Dreams Come True, is actually a sequel. Well, okay, maybe not much of a sequel because it involves time travel and going back to the past to change up the original movie, which, in my opinion, just made the original film even better. This is probably the one direct-to-DVD sequel that I would say is 100% better than the original. Now, let's talk about why. First off, the animation. Despite being low quality by today's standards, it's way better than the original movie. Granted, this was kind of made with a TV show budget, but again, way better looking than the TV show turned into a movie, Dreams Come True. This was made by people who actually cared about making a good movie, which I really enjoyed. There's also the character development here, which is way better than the original because I keep criticizing the original for not having Cinderella be her own character in her own movie. But this movie actually gave her a lot of character development and allowed her to step out into a world where she was able to be her own heroine. And of course, Prince Charming, despite the fact that everybody just calls him the Prince, so he doesn't even have a name, he gets a lot of character development here in this movie. And we see that on-screen chemistry that makes Cinderella a love story, which is really good. As for the music is probably the best that it's ever been in the Cinderella franchise. Way better than the original soundtrack, and honestly, a lot more catchy and able to get into your head. There's a lot of good songs like Perfectly Perfect, Cinderella at the Ball, and my personal favorite because it's just so emotional and dives so deeply into Cinderella's character and motivation, More Than a Dream. As for the humor was extremely good. Not as dark as the original, where the king kept threatening to cut off the Duke's head, but still really good and extremely funny. In fact, I would probably argue that it's the funniest out of the entire trilogy. So, with that in mind, let's talk about this movie and why it's so good with the story. So, the story picks up 1 year after the original movie, where Cinderella and Prince Charming are living out their happily ever after, and for some strange reason, Anastasia decides to follow them, at which point she discovers Fairy Godmother and the reason why Cinderella was able to dance with the prince at the ball. So, Anastasia grabs the magic wand and then goes home to Lady Tremaine and Drizella, and then when the fairy godmother shows up, she accidentally turns the fairy godmother into stone by saying bibbidi bobbidi boo. And then when Lady Tremaine sees the wand is actually magical, she's able to put a plan into action. A plan she's probably been thinking of for an entire year as a way to get revenge on Cinderella and get one of her own daughters to be married to the prince. So she turns back the clock by 1 year, at which point they manage to show up right when the Duke is supposed to present the slipper to the maidens to try to find the one that fits. I do have a couple of problems with this though, because unfortunately there are a few inconsistencies. First off, Anastasia keeps talking about how she wants to find someone who loves her, but she found that someone in the sequel, Dreams Come True. However, I guess we kind of ignored that, but they did bring back the baker in an end credit, so they signified that Anastasia did get her happily ever after with him. But the big thing for me is when they went back in time, they went to before the Duke showed up at their house. And then before the Duke shows up, the mice show up to Cinderella's door to give her the key. Problem is, in the original movie, they didn't steal the key until after the Duke was inside the house. So if they're already upstairs again, yeah, that's just an inconsistency. Luckily, it's pretty easy to ignore because the rest of the movie is just that much better. So after they try to get the slipper to fit on Anastasia, suddenly Lady Tremaine uses the magic wand to make the slipper grow, at which point it fits Anastasia's foot. So apparently Anastasia is the chosen girl. So when Cinderella tries to go downstairs and prove she has the other slipper, Lady Tremaine ends up breaking the other slipper and telling Cinderella to stay far away from the castle. And so Cinderella has kind of given up all sense of hope. But that's when the mice show up and say, wait, shouldn't the prince be able to recognize that Anastasia isn't the girl that he danced with? And so Cinderella decides to go to the castle, and I really love the way how they portrayed she needed to get in by pretending to be a servant girl, more specifically a royal mouse catcher, and they also gave a bunch of the castle staff personality and even brought back Prudence from the sequel Dreams Come True in not one, but 2 scenes. And luckily, the mice were right. When Prince Charming was presented Anastasia, he just said, it appears that apparently the glass slipper, which is a size 4.5, apparently it fits more than one girl, so they got the wrong girl. So he tries to leave, but that's when Lady Tremaine uses a magic spell to hypnotize him into thinking Anastasia is the girl that he danced with at the ball. The mice actually see this, and they try to go warn Cinderella, but unfortunately, Cinderella ends up running into the prince, at which point they get into a nice conversation, which turns into a disaster when Prince Charming says that he is going to marry Anastasia, and it just breaks Cinderella's heart because that just means the prince had no love for her whatsoever, and he doesn't remember that she was the one he was dancing with. Luckily, the mice show up and say that Fairy Godmother put the spell on Prince Charming, so she's not going to give up just yet. She makes a plan to steal the wand from Fairy Godmother and then use it to free Prince Charming from the spell. Meanwhile, Prince Charming is getting to know a little bit more about Anastasia, and unfortunately, at almost every turn, Anastasia is acting less and less like the girl he danced with at the ball. But the final straw is when he touches her hand. It feels nothing like the hand that he touched when he was dancing yesterday. And unfortunately, Anastasia doesn't even dance anything like the girl that he was dancing with earlier. She's constantly stepping on his feet. And that's when the king decides to talk to Anastasia. And there's another inconsistency with the king. In the original movie, he's focused on trying to get his son married off so that he can have some grandchildren running around the castle. Unfortunately, in this movie, those hypothetical grandchildren are never even mentioned once, so that's another inconsistency. But despite that, I really loved the king and his character in this, because he was having a heart-to-heart with Anastasia about how he met his own wife, and he gave her a valuable possession of a seashell. Turns out this was the seashell that he touched when he first met his wife.
Reminds me of my queen. She trod on my feet too.
So he realizes that this might actually be true love and inspires Anastasia to try to find someone who loves her for her. And right now she thinks that the prince loves her even though he's under a bit of a spell. But with that in mind, when Cinderella shows up and tries to take the magic wand away from Lady Tremaine, she tries to undo the spell but just doesn't get there before the guards manage to catch her. She tries to plead with the prince to recognize her, and then she reaches out her hand and touches the prince, at which point the prince recognizes her hand from somewhere. He realizes that that hand is the hand of the girl that he danced with at the ball. And Anastasia, his supposed girl that he danced with, feels different than that hand. So he thinks he's going crazy, especially when a couple of birds and talking mice show up to try to tell him that Cinderella, or in this case Cinderella, was the girl that he danced with at the ball via a song. Unfortunately, Cinderella is being banished from the kingdom by the stepmother, so she's on a boat ready to say goodbye to her happily ever after, giving up all hope. And then the prince shows up out of nowhere and jumps onto the boat, which is already leaving port, and he rescues the servant girl named Cinderella, who is actually Cinderella. But as the two get to know each other on their way back, the spell begins to lift, so now he actually remembers Cinderella was the girl that he danced with. And this means that when he shows up to the kingdom, he tells his father that he was under a magic spell from Lady Tremaine, so he sends the guards to go catch them. But they use the magic wand to escape, at which point they come up with a plan B. if they can't convince the prince to not marry Cinderella, they will just turn Anastasia into Cinderella. So Lady Tremaine uses magic to make Anastasia look exactly like Cinderella and then teleport the real Cinderella away into a pumpkin carriage with Lucifer as the coachman. So Lucifer, being the evil cat that he is, tries to drive Cinderella and the pumpkin carriage off of a cliff. And at the very last moment, Cinderella manages to break out of the pumpkin carriage and then jump onto the horse that's pulling it. And so Lucifer is returned back to normal and ends up stranded in the middle of the woods. So Cinderella rides the horse back to the castle where the prince and Anastasia, disguised as Cinderella, is being married. So Anastasia is going to get the happily ever after she wanted, right? Turns out that when the vows are supposed to be said of I do, she says I don't. And the big reason is because she doesn't want to marry the prince. She just wants to marry someone who loves her for her. And the prince apparently needs to be under a magic spell, or she needs to look like his true love in order to do that. And so she decides that she doesn't want to marry the prince. So Lady Tremaine decides to get revenge on both Anastasia and the real Cinderella when she shows up by turning them into toads. Luckily, Prince Charming uses his sword to deflect the spell back to stepmother and Drizella, and they turn into toads. So Anastasia picks up the fairy godmother wand, uses it to turn herself back into her real self. Then she brings fairy godmother back from the alternate timeline and reverts her back into flesh instead of stone. At which point, Fairy Godmother walks up to Cinderella and Prince Charming, who are happily getting married, and she says, "Would you like me to return you to your former lives?" But after a while, she just decides, "Know what, this is a happy ending anyway, so I guess it's okay if we let it stay around." And that's the end of the movie, which, in my opinion, is way better than the ending of the original. Because, well, the original movie is kind of just a bland, generic fairy tale where Cinderella just happened to be the girl who fit the slipper. Now, in this movie, we see both Cinderella and Prince Charming fighting to get each other. Despite the fact that Prince Charming is under a spell, he knows that he needs to find his true love. And that is really good. I love this movie because it kind of fixed what the original Cinderella didn't do. It gave both Cinderella and Prince Charming character development and actual chemistry that proved why they belong together instead of just some random guy and girl. They also had an actual villain here, with Lady Tremaine being a legitimate threat thanks to Fairy Godmother's wand, and Anastasia got a bit of a redemption arc. Even though she didn't find true love in the movie, it's revealed, or at least hinted at, that she did find true love with the baker that she met in the original sequel, Dreams Come True. So it's a happily ever after for everybody except the villains, which includes Lady Tremaine and Drizella, who, after being turned back into human, realize that they've been demoted to servant people. And then also Lucifer, who's kind of just lost in the woods. Something tells me he'll work his way back though, but he's not going to be much of a villain because he's just a generic cat. So with that in mind, I really enjoyed this movie because it was a part 2 to a part 1 that we didn't even know was left on a cliffhanger. In my opinion, it fixed all of the mistakes that the original movie made by undoing the original movie and changing the ending to make it so much better. Was it perfect? No, there are a few inconsistencies, but despite that, it was still really good and definitely worth watching if you want an actual love story between Cinderella and Prince Charming. And the best part is, you don't even need to watch the original sequel, Dreams Come True, because, well, that movie just didn't happen. In fact, you could probably watch it after this movie and it would still make sense in some way. Though you would have to excuse the fact that Anastasia is still living with Lady Tremaine and Drizella. Another thing that this movie did was, despite being made with a lower budget, it was actually animated better than the original, mostly due to the age of the original, but it also had way better songs, good voice acting, and above all else, a super amazing story that fixed what was broken with the original. And that's it for my review. What do you guys think of this movie? Would it have been better if it didn't happen, or are you glad that it did? Make sure to leave your thoughts down below in the comments section, and feel free to support my channel by joining my membership program, or you can just do the free option and subscribe. Also, if you are subscribed, be sure to check out when I reviewed the live-action remake that Disney made back in 2015. But with that in mind, I hope that you're all staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.
I forbid you to take another step down these stairs!
Okay.
Son!